Thank you. We now move to questions to the First Minister. Question 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
With permission, Deputy Presiding Officer, I should tell the Chamber that I spoke with the Prime Minister this morning about the hostage-taking situation in Algeria. As the Chamber will know, a terrorist group has seized the BP Statoil facility in the Algerian Sahara. Citizens of a number of nationalities involved, including UK citizens. I can confirm to the Chamber a number of Scots are among the hostages. The UK Government reports that one UK national has been killed in the attack. I know the Chamber will understand, in the interests of the safety and security of the hostages, the information that can be given out is necessarily limited. The priority is their safety and, of course, to keep families informed. The Scottish Police Service is fully engaged with the Metropolitan Police on the latter, and Scottish Government ministers are in contact with the Foreign and Commonwealth offices on the former. This is a hugely serious situation, and I know that the whole Chamber is united both in condemnation of the attack and also in hoping for the early and safe release of the hostages.
Thank you. Joanne Lamont.
Can I thank the First Minister for that? And of course, we entirely agree with him in the conclusion he comes to. And of course, our thoughts are with the families concerned at this very difficult time. On the 22nd of March 2010, the then Health Secretary Nicola Sturgeon said, and I quote, "Hidden waiting lists have been abolished." She added, no one is on a hidden waiting list. On the 21st of March last year, she told this Parliament there were hidden waiting lists at NHS Lothian, but assured us nowhere else in Scotland. Since then, failures in waiting times have been discovered at NHS Tayside, and questionable activity has been reported at NHS Forth Valley, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and NHS Lanarkshire. And yesterday, we learned of serious problems with NHS Grampian. In the light of that, was Nicola Sturgeon misleading Parliament and the country, or was she just incompetent and not on top of her job?
First Minister.
Well, two things. Of course, just let's remember that under the Labour Party, hidden waiting lists within the National Health Services were endemic. And these endemic practices were abolished by the Scottish National Party. So I don't think any Labour leader is in a position to attack the SNP in terms of waiting lists across the National Health Service. But in terms of the situation in NHS Grampian, it's something which obviously as a local MSP I'm well aware of. Indeed, all local MSPs should be well aware of it because they were given a briefing by NHS Grampian in December. But can I just point out that the 18-week treatment time guarantee, that's from referral by consultant, has not been breached in NHS Grampian. They had a serious difficulty with one of their DEXA scanners. It went out of operation due to a flood. That has resulted in a backlog of treatment. But the Health Board prioritised, as it should do, those who were covered by the 18-week guarantee and, of course, cancer patients who have an even more rigorous guarantee. The situation reported about 3,500 people in a backlog is quite untrue. The backlog consists of 500 cases, and these are being dealt with in terms of action by the Health Board. 550 patients who provision is being made for the Golden Jubilee Hospital to help clearing that backlog. I can confirm that the DEXA scanner is now back in operation at NHS Grampian, and both their scanners in Aberdeen are being moved to the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. Nothing of this justifies the charge that there are hidden waiting lists in NHS Grampian. Hidden waiting lists across the National Health Service were abolished when the Labour Party were tuffed out of office.
Joanne Lamont.
That answer is just astonishingly complacent, because, of course, I didn't just talk about Grampian, although the First Minister may wish to reflect that the Auditor-General said there was £1 billion of backlog in repairs, and £500 million of that may affect patient care. That may be part of the reason why there was a problem with the scanner in the first place. But I talked about other places too. Now, the First Minister, I understand, has a London life coach. It would suit him to make sure he understood what the real life was for most people in this country. Simply denying there's a problem and talking about what happened before he was responsible is not the job of the First Minister. Because before the SNP's hidden waiting time scandal broke, the figures across Scotland for patients missing appointments for treatment due to social unavailability peaked at almost 21,000 in June 2011 and has now fallen to just over 9,500. If the figures weren't being fiddled before, how does the First Minister explain that patients are suddenly available appointments that they weren't available for before?
First Minister.
I think the very fact that Joanne Lamont is now able to quote figures indicates the difference between the SNP position and the Labour Party position. In 2006, we knew only after investigation that 35,000 people had been given an ASC. That was the system by which people were hidden in the National Health Service, so statistics could never come to light. Now, I am a North East of Scotland MSP. I and my family and my constituents use the health service in Grampian. And therefore, I do think I've got perhaps more immediate knowledge of the situation than Joanne Lamont has. So let's have a look at the current performance of NHS Grampian. And the idea, incidentally, that if the Labour Party were in charge, there wouldn't be flooding in any building across Scotland, I think is one of the most remarkable indications even for Joanne Lamont. But NHS Grampian's current performance is that 90.3% of patients in NHS Grampian were seen and treated with 18 weeks from referral, against the national standard of 90%. On the 30th of September 2012, no patient in NHS Grampian had waited more than 12 weeks for a first outpatient consultation or inpatient and day case treatment. That compares with waits of 6 months in March 2007 under the Labour Party. So let the Labour Party be the last people to come to this chamber and pretend that the National Health Service was safe in their hands. Under Labour, tens of thousands of patients were on hidden waiting lists.
Joanne Lamont.
The First Minister doesn't seem to understand something very basic. This is not the difference between the SNP's position and Labour's position. This is the difference between the SNP's position and the real world that everybody else is living in. And the First Minister says he can give us all these figures about Grampian. I asked him not just about Grampian, I asked him about the whole of the country. But he also should reflect that his own internal audits tell us there is not sufficient data to know what the scale of the scandal and the problem is, and you might want to address that problem too. So we seem to be in a place where Nicola Sturgeon said hidden waiting lists were abolished, and she was right. When Nicola Sturgeon said the only problem with hidden waiting times was in Lothian, and she was right. And when it turns out that there are problems the length and breadth of the country, she's still right. According to the First Minister, the system Nicola Sturgeon presided over was working well. So why then is her successor, Alec Neil, having to change the system because it is not transparent enough?
First Minister.
Can I just point out, it was Nicola Sturgeon as Health Secretary who ordered the investigation into NHS Lothian. I remember having this conversation last week with Joanne Lamont, and I pointed out the praise which had been heaped on Nicola Sturgeon as Health Secretary as she was leaving office. And I remember Jackie Baillie looking askance. I actually had to question whether I remembered it correctly. And I looked up last year. This on the 5th of September 2012. Jackie Baillie, regardless of that and the differences I've had with the Deputy First Minister, I've always respected her talent and energy. I've always enjoyed working with her. We are missing you already, Nicola. It's a shame that the talent and energy are being diverted. Joanne Lamont has achieved almost the impossible. She's less optimistic than even Jackie Baillie.
Joanne Lamont.
if I were the First Minister, I would listen back to that, and I think you might find it a little more than embarrassing, because I am asking him about a very serious issue. A very serious issue. He says Nicola Sturgeon called the investigation into NHS Lothian. The problem is she didn't then look at what the answers to that investigation were, and she didn't look beyond NHS Lothian to find out what was happening in the rest of the country. It would appear that Nicola Sturgeon was the Health Secretary for the good bits, but the bad bits are nothing to do with this government whatsoever. But the trouble is, it's the bad bits and the difficult bits that patients across Scotland and staff across Scotland having to face every day of the week, and it's about time the First Minister took responsibility. Because the First Minister this week has been talking about the rights Scots could have under a written constitution in a separate Scotland. Well, let me tell him a right all Scots should have now, and he might need to write it down. The right to a government which tells the truth. The right to a First Minister. The right to a First Minister who will be straight with them. The right to be treated by the NHS within 18 weeks. And the right to be told the truth when this government can't deliver. Isn't it the case that whether it's the First Minister on Europe, John Swinney on the Bank of England, Mike Russell on colleges, or Nicola Sturgeon on NHS waiting times, the people of Scotland cannot trust a word this government says?
First Minister.
Just in case Joanne Lamont missed it in her peroration, the phrase was Tony Blair on Iraq. It was Nicola Sturgeon who ordered the investigation. We've already had the account across Scotland and the health boards. The reason that Joanne Lamont has moved off Grampian is the charges she made in her first question do not stand up to any examination whatsoever. I'll tell you the reason that we doubt Labour's bona fides on this issue. And since it was Eleanor Bradford who did the reports on BBC Scotland about NHS Grampian, this is relevant. In December, last month, she gave a story about health inequalities in Scotland, and this is what she put. She said, and I quote her exactly, "I put this report on health inequalities to the main political parties yesterday. The SNP said it had shifted to more preventative spending. The Labour and Liberal Democrats parties have both called it respectively a disgrace and disturbing, until I pointed out to them that they were in government for this period and also therefore must share part of the responsibility. And they said they would get back to me with an amended statement, but I'm still waiting for that." You see, even when it is totally clear, as in health inequalities, that the Labour Party shares responsibility across this chamber, the reflex action is to call it a disgrace and a disaster, followed by an embarrassed silence, rather like Jackie Bailey in hospital-acquired infections last year, when they find out that part of the statistics are the period they were in office. That's why people doubt whether the Labour Party have a genuine concern for the National Health Service, because they're unwilling to face the failures in terms of their time in office, which I'm delighted to say that Nicola Sturgeon heavily improved and amended in her excellent term of office as Health Secretary. But the bitterness, of course, extends because it's dispossession. The Labour Party cannot get used, after all these years, to the fact they're no in government in Scotland, which is why, presumably, her deputy just yesterday or the day before yesterday, days after calling for a raise in the quality of debate in Scotland, suggested that Scotland was not a democratic place, this Parliament, in the conventional sense. This is a proportional Parliament elected by the people of Scotland. Unlike in Westminster, where government is foisted on the people with no mandate whatsoever.
Thank you. Question 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. May I also associate myself with the comments made by the First Minister regarding the very serious situation in Algeria, and to ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Deputy Presiding Officer, in the week before Christmas, I asked the First Minister why he'd promised the people of Scotland he'd spend up to £500 million on NPD big building projects between 2011 and 2013, but would actually spend just £20 million. He blamed legal delays on the Aberdeen bypass. Is that still his reasoning?
Minister.
gave the Aberdeen bypass and the peripheral route as an indication that in a project-based financial system like non-profit distribution trusts, obviously the project has to come forward in order for the money to be spent. The Aberdeen bypass, if I remember correctly, the peripheral route, I think the budget is some £600 million. Therefore, it is a substantial part of the NPD programme. I remember the exchange as well, because that is a perfectly reasonable explanation given the delays, which are no part of this government's choice, that took place in that project, and the fact that this chamber, of course, welcomes the fact that the legal challenges have been fought off and that project is now going ahead. But I'm just wondering, and I remember the looks on the North East of Scotland colleague's face when she pursued that line of questioning. Is, for example, the position of the Conservative Party that we should have spent the money on another NPD and then not had it available for the peripheral route in the North East of Scotland? I don't think so. It's a perfectly reasonable situation, and I think folk in Scotland, folk in particular in the North East of Scotland, are delighted that under this government that badly needed peripheral route is now going ahead.
Thank you. Ruth Davidson.
Well, I'm no Sarah Montague, but I was there for that exchange as well. And if you look back at the transcripts, the First Minister may wish to make his weekly trip to the official report this afternoon as he reviews that. So he's broadly sticking to his story that the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route had an issue to do with NPD spend. But yesterday, we heard something different from the man in charge of the organisation that this First Minister personally set up to build new schools and hospitals. And that's the head of the Scottish Futures Trust, Barry White, who said that the unspent millions were very little to do with the Aberdeen bypass, which was, and I quote, more for 13, 14 and onwards. So after EU advice that didn't exist, college funding which was going down instead of up, yet another example of the First Minister telling the people of Scotland something which is simply untrue. And the real tragedy here is that our construction industry and our communities were promised nearly £500 million of NPD big building projects which this First Minister has failed to deliver. Even his own placemen on the Finance Committee, John Mason and Kenny Gibson, said that the whole NPD scheme is over-optimistic. So will the First Minister now hold his hands up and admit he's not spending the NPD money, his excuses don't stack up, and that barely a brick has been laid?
First Minister.
Ruth Davidson has just made a statement. We're not spending the NP money. All of the NPD programme and more is going ahead. It is simply untrue that we are not spending the non-profit distribution money, and by any estimation, the NPD programme and the Scottish Future Trust has been an extraordinary success. How do we know that? Because even George Osborne is turning away from the private finance initiative and trying to see a non-profit system similar to the NPD programme in Scotland. The position the Scottish Government faced was a 30% and more cut in the capital budget. The great advantage of direct capital spending by government is it can be processed quickly, as John Swinney has so amply demonstrated time after time in the capital budget. The NPD programme is a fantastic improvement on a discredited private finance initiative, and far from being cut back in any way, all of the non-profit distribution programme is being spent. And given the remarkable savings that the Scottish Futures Trust have brought into being as a result of being established by this government, criticised by the Conservative Party, Ms Davidson should hang her head in shame as suggesting either we should go not spend the money, not have the programme, not have the schools, not have the peripheral route, not have the capital spending, or alternatively move back to the discredited, wasteful private finance initiative, even abandoned by her colleagues in London.
Thank you. A constituency supplementary now from Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister welcomed the recent news this morning that it is now deemed safe for the oil to start flowing again from Comrade Alpha. But what action can the Scottish Government take in respect of leaks such as the one we've just experienced at Comrade Alpha?
First Minister.
Well, through Marine Scotland, of course, the Scottish Government has responsibility for environmental concerns. In major leaks in the past, of course, we've had our officials embedded into the the incident room, which I think is an excellent way to pursue. The initial responsibility in terms of security of oil supplies currently lies, of course, with the Westminster Government. But I think the Chamber will wish to note that the precautionary shutdown of the Cormorant Alpha platform, with the effects it had on the other platforms in the Brent system, was exactly the right thing to do, that the problem was identified remarkably quickly and has been dealt with, and now production is resuming across the Brent system. I think, and it's a very legitimate issue for Dennis Robertson to bring to the Chamber, but I think that the practice in terms of Cormorant Alpha, and of course there will be an official instant report which will examine this in detail, would seem at first sight to be an excellent example of how you respond in terms of the company and its procedures to an oil leak incident such as this. It does, of course, remind us that the recovery of oil and gas and hydrocarbons from the waters around Scotland is an inherently difficult process, and the procedures in order to safeguard the environment have to be first class.
Thank you. Question 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
Tomorrow, the new Scottish Police Authority is set to strip the Chief Constable of significant powers and impose 3 new powerful group directors over whom the Chief Constable will have no control. Last time, the First Minister laughed this off as creative tension. Since then, the Chief Constable has called for fresh legislation, and both sides have spent thousands hiring lawyers to fight each other. Is the First Minister still laughing?
First Minister.
Well, can I just dispute the premise of the question? I've never regarded this as anything other than a serious matter, but what I've said to the Chamber, I believe it's capable of resolution, and I hope that every member of the Chamber is looking upon it in that attitude. I don't actually agree with the detail, never mind the premise of Willie Rennie's question, but perhaps it's better to allow the meeting to take place tomorrow, and then if Willie Rennie wants to question me next week, then no doubt he will have the opportunity. Well, in terms of the structures we're set up, can I just point out to the Chamber, it isn't actually for the First Minister to determine these matters. But make no mistake that the Government is well aware of the responsibilities it has and will discharge these responsibilities.
Willie Rennie.
If the First Minister will forgive me, I'll ask him the questions this week when it matters, before the decisions are taken, because he's responsible to this Parliament and he should answer the questions. And he shouldn't be so complacent about it. Despite what he says, the Chief Constable has been stripped of his independence, and it gets worse. How can the Chief Constable be held to account by the police authority when that authority will control many of the services themselves? It will be a jumble and it will lead to a blame game. The Chief Inspector of Constabulary said the authority will not be able to hold itself to account. Will the First Minister just accept that the legislation is not fit for purpose and must be changed?
First Minister.
No, I don't accept that the legislation passed by an overwhelming majority in this Parliament is not fit for purpose. I'm quite certain that the Labour benches, if they had felt it wasn't fit for purpose, would have realised that and not voted for it when we came to decision time. I don't think it's a question of the legislation. I think it's a policy question. I dispute Willie Rennie's premise in 2 ways. Firstly, I regard this as a situation that needs to be resolved. I regard it seriously, and the Government takes its responsibilities extremely seriously in this matter. The other reason I dispute Willie Rennie's premise is that I think if he waits to see the decisions that are made, it will turn out that the premise of his question was actually inaccurate. That's why I sometimes think it's better to... Well, I could do this in a range of figures, like, for example, his forecasts on college waiting lists, which may or may not turn out to be true. But I think it would be better, given the meetings tomorrow, to wait and see what actually happens, and then Willie Rennie can come back, as opposed to trying to answer a question which I do assure Willie Rennie is based on an aspect of false premise.
Many thanks. Question 4, Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the impact of UK pension reforms in Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, obviously the precise implications require further study, and that is being done by the Scottish Government. But it's already pretty clear that the initial claims that the majority would be better off are not, in fact, true. It does appear now, from the analysis, particularly by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that most people, including women who are supposed to be the big winners from this change, will actually end up with a lower pension.
Jim Eadie.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, but what action can the Scottish Government take to protect the people of Scotland from UK pension reforms that will consign so many of our older citizens to poverty in old age through a miserly state pension? And does he agree that these reforms are further evidence that we are neither in this together nor better together?
First Minister.
Obviously, across the range of social security and the deserved areas, the Scottish Government has also taken the action it can, and that is limited action when powers lie elsewhere to try and mitigate some of the effects, for example, in council tax benefits or indeed the emergency loan fund. But let's not pretend that without the power and authority over these areas, that the Scottish Government can do anything other than ameliorate some of the worst effect of changes that are going to be made at Westminster. I saw the Conservative benches look somewhat askance when I said that the vast majority of people are going to be worse off. Can I quote exactly from the Institute of Fiscal Studies? As is often the case with pension reforms, the overall effects will be more complex and in the long run will be to reduce pensions for the vast majority of people, unquote. So I think the Institute of Fiscal Studies analysis would suggest that the initial presentation of the changes earlier this week was somewhat gilding the lily by the UK Government. And I think this whole area, in terms of the attitude of the UK Government across the range of things, is going to hugely strengthen the yes case in the upcoming referendum campaign.
Thank you. Question 5, Lewis MacDonald.
The First Minister whether the Scottish Government allows convicted criminals to post online material purporting to cast doubt on their conviction.
First Minister.
Well, those serving sentences in prison are not allowed access to the internet. This Parliament passed the Criminal Justice and Licensing Scotland Act in 2010, which makes it illegal for prisoners to have in their possession any device which allows them to post material online.
Lewis MacDonald.
Will the First Minister confirm that Rule 73 of the Scottish Prison Rules forbids the use of films or recordings obtained in prison for transmission by any form of electronic medium without the prior written consent of the Governor and subject to such conditions as the Governor may impose? Will he confirm today whether the Scottish Prison Service gave such written consent in the case relating to the murder of Jodie Jones, whether it imposed conditions to prevent that film being posted online, and what action will be taken in this case if conditions attached to written consent have been breached?
First Minister.
See if I can be helpful to the member, because I know that everyone will deeply regret the hurt and upset that irresponsible use of this footage will have inflicted on the family and friends of Jodie Jones. On Tuesday, 15th of January, Brigadier Hugh Munro, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons, visited the prison concerned. Following this meeting, Chief Inspector has said and issued this report to the Scottish Prison Service, and I'll quote it exactly. It says he's investigated the matter. It is clear that the Governor followed Rule 63, which entitles a prisoner to an extraordinary visit, provided it is in the sight and hearing of a prison officer. He therefore allowed the prisoner to go ahead with the visit by the British Polygraph Association. The test was carried out in the agent's area, and it was agreed it could be filmed by the testers. All of this was set out in a letter from the Governor to the prisoner. All of this appears to have been carried out correctly and within prison rules. My view would be that the SPS have acted correctly and in good faith. At no stage has the SPS at any level authorised or encouraged the film to be uploaded onto YouTube. However, in light of the circumstances, the full circumstances surrounding the case, the SPS intend to review the processes for considering any future requests and consider ways in which safeguards can be put in place to ensure that the feelings of victims and their families are given full consideration and appropriately acknowledged. And lastly, can I say that in our judicial system we have a huge range of checks and balances, and if the appeals process is exhausted and people still maintain there could have been a breach of justice, then of course we have the SCCRC as the final stop for such processes. That is the correct process which to use for people in that position, because that follows the integrity and processes of Scots law.
Thank you. Question 6, Liz Smith.
What recent discussions the Scottish Government has had with NHS boards about the appointment procedures for senior health managers?
First Minister.
Well, clearly the Government discusses a wide range of issues with the boards, not least our aim of reducing the number of NHS senior management posts by 25%, which since we announced this initiative in 2010 have already been reduced by 16.1% between March 2010 and 2012. However, Liz Smith will be aware that the appointment of individual senior managers is the responsibility of individual NHS health boards in accordance with their locally agreed recruitment policies and procedures.
Liz Smith.
I thank the First Minister for that. First Minister, when Nicola Sturgeon was Health Minister, she rightly put in place procedures to ensure that the appointment process for senior doctors and consultants with health boards was based on full transparency and public accountability. Does the First Minister now agree with his colleague John Wilson, who made clear his concerns at the weekend that the recent process adopted for the appointment of a senior manager in one Scottish health board lacked that same transparency and accountability? And will he agree that the Scottish Government has a responsibility to address that?
First Minister.
Entirely legitimate question to raise, as indeed for any member to comment on a situation. And as a result of the reports in the Sunday Herald, the Health Secretary requested clarity and assurances from NHS Tayside on the appointment concerned. NHS Tayside are clear this appointment was consistent with their organisational change policies. In the consideration of the change, NHS Tayside sought independent advice from the National Evaluation Committee on any potential impact of the move of the Associate Director to the role of Director. It was the NEC's view that change from Associate Director to Director, that a change in grade would not arise simply based on the change in title, and that as an essence of the role neither being diminished or substantially grow, there was no requirement to re-evaluate the grading. I think crucially in this matter it now transpires, which was not in the press report concerned, that there was no change in salary involved in this process, which tends to support, I would have thought, the view of the National Evaluation Committee, which NHS Tayside had sought. But as you see, as the member sees, that the Health Secretary, of course, responded to the press report. No question that members of this Parliament are perfectly entitled to raise these matters, quite properly so. But I think the member will agree that the Health Secretary has also fulfilled his function in ensuring that matters were properly carried out in NHS Tayside.
Thank you, and that concludes questions to the First Minister. I will now have a short pause to allow members who are not participating in the members' business debate to leave, and for the public gallery to leave quickly and quietly before the next debate begins.